Hey, Keith, it's Zach Martin. How you doing?
Hey, Zach, how are you?
I'm doing well. I figured I would call a little bit earlier.
Oh, that's fine.
Because I'm too excited.
Good to hear.
All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over a little bit of your work history.
Okay.
Maybe ask a couple of questions, and then we'll get into the book and anything else you'd like to talk about.
Yeah, sure.
Okay?
It'd be great.
All right. I get a page over here. I'm going to go right from the book. You know, I did a book once myself, and it was about a true crime series. It was about the murder of my mom.
Oh, wow.
And it was done by a serial killer. I call him a serial murderer. I always make that distinction when I speak about it. Charles Cullen, he was a nurse, right?
Oh, right.
And so I had to put the book together within, I think, 3 months, and I worked with Cliff Leindecker, who was a novelist, and, give him all the information, put it all together, and then I really didn't pay attention to the editor's copy before I said, yeah, okay, print it. I just, leaf through it like most people do, and I'm like, I read the book a little bit afterwards. I'm like, oh, my gosh, the spelling is awful. Their facts are confused. I'm like, I should have really paid attention, so...
Yeah. Well, you never know when you're dealing with editors. As having been an editor, and I know how that can be, and having worked with editors.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I figure, well, they must know their job really well. I mean, let them handle it. And then and then I know other people that have written books, and it seems like just when you think you got it, everything, you find that little thing that annoys you. But just want to let you know I can relate.
Okay, good.
Right.
I had a saying. There's a saying, editors are like assholes. They just want to just close up and say no. And you got to get around that.
Well,
it's an old saying from the newspaper business.
Good way to put it.
Yeah.
All right. Ready to go?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm Zach Martin on the Big Fat American Radio Network. We have a special guest with us. It's Keith Girard. He's been a reporter and in the news business for over 35 years. His career began in Washington, D.C. He worked there as a reporter, editor for 18 years, started out as an intern at the Washington Bureau of South Carolina's leading newspaper, The State. He witnessed firsthand and wrote about the unfolding of Watergate. Wow, that's interesting. He became a reporter at the Washington Post in 1984. He reported on the Grenada invasion, the Nicaraguan Civil War, how U.S. companies provided Saddam Hussein with poison gas, this, that, and the other thing. Now, just to let you know that I was in the Army at the time of the Grenada invasion. I wasn't part of it, but because the Army was activated, the military was at whatever DEFCON, I qualified to be a member of the American Legion just because of that. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
It lasted, 8 hours thereabouts?
Well, yeah, something like that. It was over pretty quickly. They didn't have... when the Marines come charging up on the beach and the Army was there, you don't... it's pretty hard to stand against them.
Yeah, the 82nd Airborne was part of that.
Absolutely. It was an all-out assault, and believe me, they worked pretty quickly to suppress the other side.
I would like to express my thankfulness for the men and women that were involved in our operation. Because of them, I'm a member of the American Legion, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's great. Great place to drink.
So you've been writing books for a long time. How many different books have you written?
Well, actually, I've only written 2. The first book I wrote was a nonfiction book about Desert Storm, the 1991 Iraq War. And the book focused on the Marines in that conflict. And so I've always, though, had a desire to write fiction. I know a lot of people like to write nonfiction, but I feel like writing a fiction is more creative, and that's really what I wanted to be, to just something spring out of my head and unfold into a story. Well,
I think you got onto something here with the Heidelberg Conundrum, which Mickey Dolenz seems to really love because he definitely raves about it on the back of the book. And what I found really interesting is it even included an epilogue. I'm like, wow, that's really interesting, because usually you don't hear what happened to the various characters that are part of the plot.
Exactly, yeah. But I did that for a reason, because there's going to be 2 more books in this series. And so I wanted to make sure there's some continuity between the next book and this book. So I like the idea of an epilogue.
What I found fascinating is, obviously, I know it's a work of fiction, but you had to do a lot of research for writing this book. Tell me a little bit about that process. Did you go to Germany? Did you go to any of the places that you wrote about?
Well, I've always been interested in history, and actually I'm a military brat. I grew up, my father was in the Air Force, or in the Army Air Force during World War II, and he was recalled for Korea and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and my father actually was in Vietnam in 1965 as part of the Air Force. Oh, he was a civilian at that time. He was working for the Air Force. So I've been around military my whole life. And, I just wanted to write a book, a science fiction book that was reality-based. It's pretty easy to write a book when you've got wizards and magical formulas and, superheroes. But I like the idea that this is a reality-based book that, you could say almost after you're done reading it, hey, that could have really happened,
Right.
So that's what intrigued me about the whole Heidelberg Conundrum plot.
Why did you call it the Heidelberg Conundrum plot?
Well, I like the mystery of this old formula, coming out of the Middle Ages that someone postulated back then that could not be solved, but yet it was rumored to have something to do with time travel, and that immediately set the stage for possible, alien influence from another older, wiser society, and that figures into the plot as well, because there are aliens in my book.
Well, this book definitely gets you to start thinking about the world around you, and it made me contemplate on history. And when you talk about time travel and you talk about aliens and all of those things that are part of the Heidelberg Conundrum, I start to wonder how close you are to being spot on accurate with the stories, because I've heard the legend of the Philadelphia experiment. I've heard the legend of possible alien technology that the Third Reich used. I've heard the legend of the Third Reich existing in Antarctica. So in all your research, and as you wrote the book, did you ever come to a point like, you know what, I think I might be closer to the truth than I realize?
Actually, I actually did have that thought, because there was a missing link here, between the technology that existed in 1945 and this idea of flying saucers. There had to be something else that convinced, the Third Reich that they could produce these flying saucers and get them somewhere. And all this, science fiction fodder about bases on the moon and bases in Antarctica really made sense if they had a propulsion system to get them there. And so that's kind of the hole I was plugging with this story. Here's the story about a secret project, so secret that only a handful of people know about it, to come up with a technology that would allow them to travel through time and through space. And that would be the ultimate weapon. And so this book is about unraveling that, and about another world and our world getting together in the future, going back in time to prevent that from happening. So that's the storyline, basically.
Oof. I mean, when your explanation, it sounds like a simple explanation, but when you start to think about it, it almost blows your mind. Everything that's going on, it really becomes a conundrum for the reader.
Exactly. I mean, that's the whole thing. It's a mystery. It's an action-adventure book. It's got all those elements and plus a science fiction twist. So it kind of really intrigued me. And again, having a background in history and so forth. And I've been a big science fiction buff really my whole life, since early teens. I've read just dozens of science fiction books over the years, and so I really like the genre. And I'm going to stick with it for another couple books. But I do want to write a horror story.
Oh. And
I want to write a murder mystery, maybe. So I've got those in the back of my mind, too.
I've always, since you brought it up, I thought of the same thing. I wrote before we got on the air, I told you about a true crime book that I wrote. And I was thinking about this, where you hear the guy on the radio, and you assume that he's in the studio. And before technology like we had it today, all we had were reel-to-reels that we could record on and then fake it, right. You'd think we were on the air at the time. Now the technology is I could do the show from my home or do it at a different time and air it at a different time. But the alibi couldn't have been me. I was on the air. Right. And, this guy was like a crazy maniac doing all kinds of things but nobody ever suspected because I always heard him on the air at the time that the event occurred. So he had a rock-solid alibi.
Exactly.
But then one day, something happens and there's dead air, and that's how he gets caught. So, yeah, I'm right up with you on that. I think those kind of things and horror stories can be really intriguing, although I don't know about you, but anytime I watch a horror movie, I'm just wondering how stupid people really are. Oh, yeah, I hear something crazy with a chainsaw in a dark part of, the basement. Let me go down and check it out. I'd run out of the house.
Well, that's true. I mean, that's the fallacy of a lot of the horror and so forth. I mean, they're just unreasonable. And I like my plots. My books are going to be plausible, and the horror is going to take place in a human mind. It's going to be something that is not a chainsaw massacre or something like that. It's more psychological,
right?
That creates the horror. So I'm really looking forward to doing that, and this is a fun experiment. But again, I really like my writing to be plausible, and someone to say, "Wow, that could have really happened. That this kind of thing would unfold." As you
wrote your book, and as people started to pick up copies, and as it goes on sale, did you get any sort of? Let me put this out there. Did you at all feel like you might be in trouble with somebody with the CIA?
And, I thought about that, actually, but it would be beyond possible, in my opinion anyway, that I could have stumbled onto something that is truly classified and been kept a secret all these years, although that's the premise of the book, that this Project Starburst that I talk about in the book that started back in World War II has been kept secret all these years. And one of the elements or one of the characters in the book is part of this secret commission trying to track down this technology to make sure it doesn't get in the wrong hands. So yeah, there's that element to it too. It's like a spy novel.
Yeah.
It's got a lot of different twists. And one thing I thought about while I was writing it was I wanted plot twists. I wanted to kind of fool people, lead them down a path, and then take them somewhere else. And I think it does that pretty well, in my opinion. Hopefully the readers will see that as well.
I don't want to talk too much about what is in the book because then you kind of give it away. Then what's the reason to go buy it if I give all the information or we talk about all the information? It's one of those things you have to read for yourself. And then if we go too far into the book, Michael, I'm sorry, Keith, see what I did there?
Yeah.
Find out who Michael is by getting a copy of the Heidelberg Conundrum.
Right.
If I get too much into the book and we talk too much about it, then it's sort of like spoiling the ending of a really good movie or Game of Thrones. So you don't want to do that kind of stuff. What I find fascinating is your ability to take the mundane subject. I can remember being a kid in high school having to take a physics class. Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Can it be any more boring? But you kind of like get people interested in those other kind of subjects.
Exactly, because these characters don't have superpowers per se. They just have their own intelligence and their own ability to figure things out on their own. And as a kid, here's an odd thing I can tell you. I love to untie knots. For some reason as a kid, and maybe that was a precursor to kind of writing novels like this. I want this thing to unravel. And kind of just open up like a flower or something as people read it to see all the different plot lines and they all come together into a conclusion. So that's the essence of writing, in my opinion, and I hope this book does that. I feel like it does. And so, the readers will have to decide on their own. But, yeah, it's a good read. That was another thing. I wanted to write a good read, something that was action-adventure, something that was readable, that I thought, a guy getting on a plane or a woman, there's a lot of strong female characters in the book, getting on a plane, flying to the West Coast, and reading the book the whole way. That was my goal.
Well, I kind of wish a few weeks ago I flew to Germany and then back, and I got the book a couple of days ago. I was thinking, oh man, this would have been great to read, because even the artwork on it, the photo of the B-17. Can you imagine the looks I would get? Just the Heidelberg Conundrum and the German flight crew looking. What is he reading about? Very interesting things going on there. But what I really do appreciate, not only is you make it an easy read. It's not hard to follow, and as an older guy, I do appreciate the bigger print.
Right.
You know what I mean? You really thought about if I read the book, it's almost like you have the I guess the tactile insight with this book to make it look good and easy to go through. That's what makes it more fun. In other words, you ever pick up a book and everything around it's so distracting, you can't get through it?
Right. I mean, I don't want people struggling to read it. I felt like it's got to be an easy read. It's got to be a fun read, something they can sit down and, stay with or put down and pick up. That's something I thought about as I was writing it. So, yeah, you see that in the book. And I'm glad it jumped out at you because I did think about that while I was writing it.
Well, obviously, we thought alike about many different things by the questions that I'm asking you. And as an author, I would say it's got to be really frustrating when the person interviewing you either asks too many questions or doesn't know enough about the book or gives away the ending and spoils the whole thing so that nobody is, I don't want to get the book now.
Yeah, don't do that.
Now, let's talk a little bit more about your career. You've covered some amazing stories as a journalist, and I think that helped you unravel. You said you like to untie knots, and that's what a journalist really does. You try to get all the different pieces and then craft a story that gives the information in an easy, understandable way that leaves as little doubt as possible.
Right, exactly. I mean, I spent 10 years in daily newspaper journalism as a reporter, and that was a great foundation for, writing and organizing and so forth. And then in mid-career, I was a reporter for the Washington Post, and then I left the Post to go into magazine writing because I'm a big fan of what they call long-form journalism. Mm-hmm. These 5,000, 10,000-word stories you might see in the New Yorker or Esquire magazine or something like that. And that was really a big change in my career because I think I was probably one of the first telecommuters ever in this country because I had this old Cape.
You there?
I don't know if you know computers or not, but and then I would plug my phone into it and I could send my story into the magazine working out of my house. So after 10 years of, working till all hours of the night, doing all kinds of crazy stuff, I could work out of my house and kind of live the writer's life, you know what I mean? Where I had just deadlines to meet, not having to be in the office every day. So that was a big change, but also kind of prepared me for writing longer stories and, thinking more about structure and, direction and so forth.
That's when you were working with Billboard, writing about the investment part of what was going on in the industry?
Well, Billboard was a whole different story, but basically for most of the 80s and up till about 91, I worked in magazine writing.
I see.
I worked for 5 or 6 different magazines. And then after, there was a big recession, as you recall, the 90-91 recession. All those magazines went away. Mm-hmm. This is right before the Internet. And then I worked for CNN. And that's where I was able to make the connection to write the book on Desert Storm. I worked at CNN in Washington during that conflict. So that was kind of an interesting thing. And then after that, I became an editor of a newspaper in Baltimore called the Daily Record, which is a legal newspaper. And I transformed that into a business and legal newspaper and had great success with it, which led to a job offer in New York City with Investment News, which is a financial publication. And it was the same kind of thing. The publication was 18 months old, was kind of struggling, and they knew of my success in turning around the Daily Record because we were in the same journalism organization. So they offered me the job, and I was there for 3.5 years, had a great track record there, did a lot of great things, really built up the paper. And oddly enough, that led to an offer from Billboard magazine to become editor-in-chief there after Tim White died. I don't know if you remember Tim White or not. Back in the day, but he was a well-known editor for about 10 years at Billboard. And it was at a critical time in the publication's history because the record industry was changing so dramatically, and Billboard was losing relevance by the day.
Yeah, I kind of remember that point because in my career, we were struggling with this whole idea of Sirius XM, and I was interviewed for Billboard, and I said, well, it's got to give me more than just radio.
Right.
If it's going to work. I mean, what else do I get with this? Do I get, some sort of interactive experience? Do I get some GPS? I just said, there's got to be more and then I said like this, I go, there's going to be a time when our cars will be interactive. We'll have the ability to be on the web from our cars. And, not too far after that, it did happen. And I think that further fragmented what's going on in the media industry. And, of course, the digital environment has malaffected in many ways the print. So, a lot of newspapers are cutting their stabs. They're going out of business. A lot of magazines are going away. And we could talk about, how it could reverse course, but that's for a different discussion at a different time. What I wanted to get your opinion on is for the past few years since the election time, and I'm not being political, I'm not going to take any political sides, but all of a sudden we get this fake news. You hear fake news, and then I've seen friends of mine that have been victimized by kind of inaccurate reporting. One just happened the other day. It ends up on Drudge, and before you know it, people get the wrong idea, they get the wrong impression, and they close their mind. They don't want to hear any other side to the story. The decision has already been made. And then as I'm talking with Keith Girard, who's the author of the Heidelberg Conundrum, great book, you're going to love it. It's a sci-fi thriller. When I was listening to Sirius XM, I was listening to the television feed, the audio version, and the woman that was speaking, she's like, people no longer pay attention to the local news weather person when they tell them to do this, that, and the other thing. Because I think nationwide, the news media has lost credibility with just about everybody. And you get to the point where, like, you know what? I can't go by you. I don't, and I also don't need to be told what to do. So I'll just make my own. I'll rely on myself. On the information that I have, and I'll make my own decision. I don't need that. It's sort of like I don't trust any of these people anymore.
Well, that's sort of the underlying plot of my next book is that we've gone from the truth to what I call belief systems. If you believe it, then it's true, even if it's not true. It's what you believe, not what the truth may be. And this has been a process that's been going on for a long time. It didn't start yesterday. It started back with Watergate, actually, and then into the Iran-Contra scandal, and now the whole Trump thing. And also what's adding to this problem is the splintering of the media. And I know you probably know or are old enough to know that, we used to have 3 channels on the TV. Now we have hundreds. We used to have one local newspaper and, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and so forth, national newspapers. Now we have hundreds, literally, of media outlets on the web. And the web has become the predominant source of our information. Well, you can find the information that you want. It's like,
oh, yeah.
I believe this, so I can find a website out there that will tell me that.
How about this? Everybody's an expert on Facebook, regardless of what the topic might be. Now, I have 2 masters and a PhD. My PhD's in theology. I think I know about that. So when I get corrected by somebody who just looked it up on Google, I'm like, you don't even know the rest of the story. You don't even know the reason behind that statement, or you don't even know the research material that goes along with it. I found it on Wikipedia, and you know as well as I do in scholastics, and this is really a pet peeve of mine. Yeah. If you find it on Wikipedia, that is not regarded a source. You have to actually go to a library. Like there's like when you do the scholastic type of writing, you have to review your sources and you have to chart them out, the bibliography and the footnotes and all of that stuff. So
absolutely.
Maybe I have my expectations are too high. Keith, that's the problem.
I would never say that.
And
the fact is, our expectations these days are too low.
Yeah,
in terms of what we accept as truth. And people, even when you confront someone or have a conversation with someone, and you say, "Well, the Bureau of Labor Statistics says this," or the crime statistics from the FBI say this. They dispute that. They say, "Well, they're not right. They're inaccurate. They're falsified."
Right.
You can't point to any one thing to get someone to change their mind if they have a belief that they believe in that's based on pure fiction.
Yeah.
And that's why we have these conspiracy theories are running wild on the internet these days, and they have a great effect. We saw that in the election.
Well, I will say this, and you're right about that. Because of the critical skill sets that I have in regard to critical thinking. In theology, we have what's called hermeneutics. And you probably have heard this term where we extrapolate and we try to figure out the source material and the perspective of the author. There's a lot of thought that goes behind it. So when it comes to data of any type, even if it's from the BLS or the GAO or from NASA or any of those things, and if I get a whiff that the data is being corrupted I cannot rely on it with a high probability, if that makes sense, because I also understand statistics. So for me, that becomes an issue when I find out that there was tampering with it. And then, the other problem that I have with news media these days is it's not Walter Cronkite who used to get on the news, and I trusted that he was just going to give you the facts the way they were, the way they're reported. Now, regardless of what side of the political fence you're on, it's like, as long as, if it's my guy, he can't possibly be wrong. If it's their guy, he's always wrong. If there's like no middle of the road, there's no compromise, there's no ability to go, all right, well, I see it your way, or, this is the president we have for now. I mean, the election's over. Let's stop crying like babies and see what we can come up with until the next election cycle. It seems like there's less and less of cooperation. And like you said, there's splintering. And then no matter who delivers the news nowadays, I get upset because I could just hear the bias. Right. I could see the eyes roll. I could see that. I'm like, you're not in the same league as Walter Cronkite. And again, these are, high expectations that I put on the media just in general. Now I'm to the point where, forget about it. I have some writers that I can trust. It takes a little while to accumulate those, and then I pretty much will analyze the news for myself, and I can sniff out when it's kind of fake. I can't bring up what just happened in the news in the past 24 hours, but I know specifically certain things about this article. It was from the New York Times, and I'm like, man, you guys are so far off the truth on this one. But I can't comment on it for a variety of reasons. So, why don't you take us through, your style of how you pass along information, or your approach to journalism. I think I know you have this book out. It's a great book, but I just need a professional like you to give your assessment of what's going on.
Well, let me tell you, I worked for the Washington Post in the 1980s, and that, I would say, would be the golden era of newspapers. The Washington Post used to be 2 inches thick on Sundays. Today, it's not even a half-inch thick. And we had standards of reporting, and, it's an imprecise business. I think one of my editors used to call newspaper reporting the first rough draft of history, because it's never going to be perfect. You're out there, you're working on a deadline, you're trying to gather information, and what you do is you try to go to as many sources as you can, and then you try to draw a consensus of what they're saying. And then the final step is to say, hey, I'm going to provide both sides. And that's not what you're getting today in reporting. You're not getting on a Fox News, for example, you're not getting both sides. You're getting one side. Even MSNBC, which I watch a lot, they have the same, I don't think it's as bad, I think it's much more objective than Fox News, but they have the same kind of left-leaning bias. And you kind of have to factor that in when you watch the news or when you read the news. Even the New York Times, and back in my day, back when I was in newspapers, and even today, they make mistakes, And look at what happened with the New York Times in the run-up to the second Iraq War, how they bought hook, line, and sinker George Bush's claim, the Bush administration's claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be totally false. Mm-hmm. Yet the whole war was based on that premise. So, it's hard when you're dealing with people, and facts are not just easily to find out sometimes. You have to kind of get the best rough draft that you can get together and get it in the newspaper. Then you follow up. I used to tell people who would complain about a story, I said, it's like baseball. You're not going to win every game, but if you finish above 500 at the end of the season, you're doing okay. And so there's always room for corrections and always rooms for follow-ups and so forth. And I think people don't keep that in mind so much, And newspapers aren't great about following up stories, and I think there needs to be more of that. We can come back and say, hey, we reported this, but, we've since found out why, So there's some problems that could be addressed in the media. There's no question about it.
What about the people that consume the media? Aren't they kind of responsible a little bit, too?
Absolutely. I mean, because, like I said, people have belief systems these days, and they go to where they want to, the source that tells them what they want to hear, as opposed to saying, hey, I'm going to read this guy, I'm going to read that guy, and find out, and draw my own conclusions. Right. And one good analogy of that is, I go to a baseball game, and I see the game, I watch the game, The next day, I got to read what the New York Times columnist wrote about the game. I got to read what the Daily News wrote about the game. I got to read what the New York Post wrote about the game, because they don't see things quite the same way as I saw them. They see different nuances, different things happen. They point out different things. So it's very interesting to me to see how their perception of the game is different from mine. And even though I was there, they see things that I didn't see. So you've got to go to as many sources as you can and draw your own conclusions. That's all I can say, probably, for anybody that's a consumer of information these days.
I think that's spot on, because let's just take football for an example. I love the New York Giants.
Right.
And we've all had those conversations with the ref on TV. Did you see the same game? Are you blind?
Right.
That's it. Or how about this? Remember the non-call of the pass interference of the New Orleans Saints against the L.A. Rams?
Perfect example.
That went on. It's still going on. And people just can't get over it. Look, you're not going to replay the game. I think part of the problem when the story doesn't work out the way the individual wants it to, they have this thing that they create in their mind, which is an alternate universe, and they think that it's going to change to the alternate universe when they're just, you know what they are? They're in a loop, a mental loop. They'll never get out of it. So that's really interesting. And, when it comes to information and the Heidelberg Conundrum, let's think about what was going on in Nazi Germany at the time. You had a whole population that was committed to the point that they did horrible acts to other human beings, that this was definitely the way to go. I mean, they were willing to go to the grave behind Adolf Hitler.
Exactly. And that's a perfect example of what I mean by a belief system. Hitler, when he got into politics in the 1920s, he was dismissed as a kook. No one believed him, but the circumstances came about between the Depression and the hyperinflation in Germany and the failure of the government there that created an opening for him to step in and fill a power vacuum. And people, one by one, bought into his belief system. You blame the Jews, you blame this group, you blame that group for your problems. You deflect to someone else. It's not us. And, what scares me a little bit is we see the same thing in the Trump administration. I know you don't want to get too political, but we have to be wary of that, because a belief system can be very strong, and it can take over a whole country, as it did back then, and you see the consequences.
Well, you can bring that up, and I'm just not going to be political about it, but I will give you some insight that I got from a speech that I heard from this woman out of Austria. And keep in mind, I was just in the area a few weeks ago, so there's things going on right now, I think, that are rooted 75 years ago. But she goes like this. We had hard economic times in Austria. The Nazis came in, and they had these wonderful solutions. The first thing that they told us is that they were going to give us all free health care. Now, I don't want to argue about that point, but this is what the lady said.
Right.
That they were going to control the health care. And then they were going to, create a better education system. And then they were going to do this, that, the other thing. And we, okay, this sounds great. And then there was the devil in the details of, controlling the mass population. They were given one radio, and they were given one newspaper. And the radio was controlled by the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler and his henchmen, as well as the newspapers. And if you got caught listening to anything else outside of that radio or reading anything else, you could get the death penalty. Now, fast forward a little bit, I go to Germany, and I notice that they don't really make much eye contact with each other. In fact, I was told that that's rude, and people don't do small talk. They don't engage in small talk. And I come back, and I'm still thinking about that. Like, why is that? And I don't know if you know this about me, but I'm also a part-time hospice chaplain. Uh-huh. So I was called out to give last rites to a man this past Monday. And it was Memorial Day, so I asked the son, I go, is your dad a veteran? He goes, no, but he survived a Nazi labor camp. Really? Yeah, he was 15 years old. He was from Poland, and he was taken prisoner, and he was put into a labor camp. And, it wasn't a death camp. It was a labor camp, and he had to do things for the Nazi regime. And one day he was playing cards with some people, and he goes, I don't think the Nazis are going to win this war. The next day, a post office employee, the guy that delivers the mail, the mailman, comes up and starts to beat the crap out of him.
Huh.
Obviously, they let him know what was going on. And the same woman that I told you about how the Nazis took control by making all of these great promises and like a leave it to us kind of thing, if you misuse the ration stamps, you get a visit by the Gestapo, and the Gestapo says, we could put you in jail, but I'll tell you what, if you tell us what your friends are up to and what they're thinking and all of these things, you report to us, we'll forget about this. So I could see what happened 75 years ago. It still impacts what goes on today in that region, that nobody talks to everybody and they mind their own business. And you think that, more people would be not minding their own business based on the whole Holocaust thing. But no, they don't talk much, because I think to this day in their subconscious, they're worried about speaking freely and the consequences for that. So I just found that really interesting. And it made me think about what's going on here.
Yeah, well, you have to understand too that some things we accept as given. The First Amendment, for example, and free speech doesn't really exist. It has no historical precedent in other parts of the world as it does here. So we take for granted that we can say things freely with no repercussions. We can have an opinion. In other parts of the world, you got to be careful. And,
that's right.
I think that history in Europe still exists. You're right.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems I see here, now let's talk about rights for a little bit, because I find this interesting and you brought it up. People think when they go, my right, I'm like, you know something, your rights are limited. You don't have like unfettered rights. Everything is like, once you exceed the mores and the folkways and the actual laws, it's not a right, all right? So you don't have 100% total right to say whatever you want. Or you could say whatever you want, but then don't be surprised when you have consequences for that. We see people derailing their careers by the things that they tweet, and then they figure, well, I'll just delete it, or I'll apologize because now I feel bad that I got caught. It's not that they feel bad about the comment they made. But the other thing that I find a little bit disturbing, Keith, is that and you probably have seen this on Facebook, I disagree with you, or I'm not like you. That doesn't mean because I disagree with you or I have a different opinion, that doesn't make me an idiot. And you start to do the name calling and the finger pointing and, the left are lunatics and the right are Nazis, and the name calling, it devalues that other individual. And so that we don't get any closer to the truth, because you suppress you're suppressing the truth when you do that. You can't call, you're a Nazi, starting to label people. I think that is a real dangerous thing, and we see it all over Facebook. And then you have the people who are great Facebook bullies. They're really, big men behind those keys, saying whatever they want, and you meet them in person, like, oh my gosh, you look at you. If we got in a boxing match, I'd kill you. So I think that there's, what we think is freedom is not really as free as we would like it to be, and I'm really interested on your take about what's going on. And I realize that you and I probably don't agree on every political aspect, but I think we're in agreement about how people react and interact and the undertow that's taking place. And you can't blame it all on whoever the president is. I think that's another bad thing that people do.
Well, it existed before the president, for sure. You go back even to the 1850s, and read some of the newspapers back in that day when they were highly political papers, almost sort of like today a little bit. We're not quite there, but in the 1850s leading up to the Civil War, the newspapers were really outrageous and making all kinds of charges and about the president, about anybody in politics. It's not a new thing, but it comes in cycles, and I think we're in one of those cycles right now. And I think part of that is the fact that the internet and Facebook and social media has given platforms to people who never had that kind of platform. One person, they talk about social media influencers, can have 1 million followers, with no other reason other than what they say or what they do. So the fact that there's such an easy access to the population, the world actually, creates this problem, I think, to a certain extent. I think our need for attention. And it's funny because when the internet first started going, and I did an interview once, and someone said, well, what is this internet thing? You're publishing websites. I said, well, it's kind of like the 1849 gold rush, You have this open access. It's low cost to get in to the internet, to put up a website. costs hardly anything, and people are rushing into it, and hundreds and hundreds of people, just like in 1849 when they discovered gold. You have hundreds of people with a pick and a shovel becoming millionaires overnight, and obviously it hasn't quite panned out that way with the internet, but that was sort of the mentality of the internet in the early days. And now we've seen it mature, and we see it getting used in ways that no one ever foresaw. And I think the 2016 election probably is the first internet election, the first social media election that we've had, where social media has had a big impact,
right?
Not only for good, but also for bad. And we're still dealing with that.
I once heard it said that President Obama was the first social media president. But I think that's there's some veritas to that. But you're right. This is the first election that was really influenced by social media on so many different levels.
I think you're right about Obama being, he was more socially more aware of social media than say George W. Bush. But in terms of the impact on the election and the flow of information, I think the internet and the social media was obviously very powerful in the election, and I think that's something we're grappling with right now, with how that's going to play out in the 2020 election and what impact social media is going to have. And there's been a lot of clamoring about Facebook has got to, close this site down, and
Yeah, I'm not a big proponent of that. I don't like that at all. I mean, some of the people have been. That's a very Bolshevik thing to purge.
In a way it is, but let me put this to you then. How about this? You can't falsely scream fire in a crowded theater.
No, that's right. Well, it goes back to our limits on freedom of speech, right? You can't say anything you want. You do have the consequences for that.
Yeah, and when you got a guy like Alex Jones, on InfoWars saying, the Sandy Hook shooting was a fraud and things like that, I think it's tantamount to screaming fire in a theater.
In regard to that, I'm not taking his side, but I don't remember, and I listened to some of the tapes, and I'm just going by what I know. He calls it a false flag. He doesn't say that the event never took place, and people misunderstand hoax with false flag. The Gulf of Tonkin was a false flag, so to speak. So, let's say someone's tuning in for the very first time. They're hearing you talk. Keith Girard, the author of the Heidelberg Conundrum. Can you tell us as a journalist the difference between a hoax and a false flag?
Oh, of course. Well, you just said it. Pizzagate was a hoax. I guess a false flag is something where an event is staged by someone and meant to look one way when it's actually staged by someone else to create that impression. For example, a demonstration takes place purporting to support one issue when it's actually, you hear this a lot in the alternative or the alt-right media. Well, that demonstration was, in fact, I heard that about the Charlottesville demonstration. That was actually engineered by the CIA. That wasn't really neo-Nazi right-wing people there. That was paid actors out in the street protesting, paid by the CIA, paid by some big banker, something like that. So, those things as if they're conspiracy theories, and and they need to be shot down when they occur. And but when you have a guy that's constantly pushing forward, like Trump with the birther issue, long past the fact that we knew it wasn't true, he continued to push it. And that's the problem we have today, where we have conspiracy theories that just won't die. People just won't believe they're not true because they support their belief system. And that's the kind of the dilemma we're in. We're like chasing our tail in a certain respect in that regard, in my opinion. Okay, to be fair, all right, you have the one fake news story about Barack Obama and the birther conspiracy, whatever you want to call it. Let's just to be fair, what is a fake story about Donald Trump that would be equivalent to that? That's a good question. Maybe you can answer that. I can't. I don't really know. I don't really know. I think that there's the whole blame. Something. Well, there could be something, but the whole blaming it on the Russians for all of that stuff. I mean, I just, here's the thing. I just do not think that people in the United States are that stupid. I think we're a little bit smarter than that to really think that the Russians pulled off what they said they pulled off. I find that a little bit
hard to digest. Maybe with all of these stories, there's an element that might be true, and I think that people might gravitate towards that. But I would say that all things being equal, that we're never going to have a perfect person in the White House, and there's going to be half the people that hate him and half the people that love him or her. You know what I'm saying? So I don't think we're ever going to be 100% happy with who's representing us in the White House. And I do think that Trump tweets from the toilet. I swear to God, because it's something that, most of us think about doing. Like, you know what? I got a good thought here. Let me just tweet this out. He must tweet from the toilet. And I'm going to go with that as being true, not false news.
Right.
Now, in regard to the false flag and how it relates to the Heidelberg Conundrum, we all know, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but there was a false flag that got Germany to war against Poland, right?
Well, yeah, there was a pretext.
Yeah,
absolutely. They fabricated a pretext.
So what kind of equivalence do you have in the Heidelberg Conundrum that people should look out for?
Let me think about that. The thing is, you have this theory that people are trying to solve. There's a big contest every year for it, and it becomes a matter of who is going to find that, who's going to discover, who's going to solve that equation, and what they're going to do with it. That's sort of what drives the book. I wouldn't say there's a false flag necessarily in there, but there is deception in the sense that people aren't who they seem to be. As you read the book, their true character becomes in the public, or becomes known. And so that's one thing that's kind of cool about the book. People aren't who they seem to be. And as you read into the book, you find out, hey, who's this person really? Who are they really representing? And some of those questions toward the end are I'll have to say unanswered because I'm writing another book, a sequel to this. But that, to me, is what really kind of drives the whole thing. People not being who they seem to be, representing themselves a certain way, trying to find this thing out by hook or crook to gain the power. And it's all about power in the end, and what they'll do, what lengths they'll go to get that power.
Hey, it sounds like a true story. So you have disinformation that's part of it, I would assume?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? That's great. I love disinformation. Yeah. And then the what do you call the literary type of tool that you use when you create characters that have a double meaning like that?
I don't know if there's a specific term for that. I guess it's just I don't really know.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. Yeah. It could be some sort of device that's used in literature. Yeah. Now, it's almost as if when you go to the Bible, because these things I do know as a theologian, right? That some of the stories and the people that are mentioned in the stories are really symbolic of something else. Like you have the prodigal and the older son, the younger son and the older son. The older son can represent the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the younger son can represent the Gentile world and stuff like that.
Right.
So those are very interesting. Now, in regard to your characters for this book, were any of them based on real people that you interacted with?
I mean, there's probably bits and pieces of real people in the book, for sure. I mean, I've dealt with a few sociopaths in my day, so some of the characters have those tendencies. Let me think. A good way to put it would be, again, people are after something. They'll do anything to get it. And when you're in that kind of situation, that's when you have these real contrasts in character. And yes, there's people in the book that represent the corporate world. There's people in the book that represent these clandestine kind of shadow organizations. One interesting thing about the book, which doesn't give away a whole lot, so I'll tell you, is that one of the characters traces his roots back to Argentina and Adolf Eichmann and the whole Nazi cabal down there. After the war, a lot of Nazi officers and so forth, leaders, were able to escape to Argentina, and they formed this group, and they had a plan to reestablish the Third Reich, the Fourth Reich, somewhere, and America was one of the places, also in South America. And, of course, Eichmann was captured by the Israelis, and that broke it up. But so there's that part of it, too, that kind of clandestine organization. And then there's the black ops from the government. There's that part of it. So it's got 3 or 4 different facets that are represented by characters that kind of drive the plot.
Well, remember when all those documents were released about the JFK assassination? It sort of pointed back to that era that you're discussing, the Operation Paperclip, the Odessa file. It's very interesting if you look at people from Argentina. Argentina. I'm trying to Argentina, right?
Yeah.
They have very German looks to them. So even before the end of World War II, Germans were in that area,
right?
And they would go to vacation and whatnot. So you'll see that look, and then you get the whole. Well, I know that this is going to blow somebody's mind, but sometimes I just wonder if the bunker story about Hitler is true. We'll just leave it out there. You'll have to research. That's your assignment if you're listening. Find out if it's true or not. Right. We're talking with Keith Girard, the author of the Heidelberg Conundrum. It was Germany's ultimate wartime secret until two distant worlds from the future joined together to crack the code and change history. Available at booksellers everywhere. Do you have a website that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I have the websites that I publish, theimproper.com, which is an entertainment website based in New York. So you can find this stuff about the book there. And, of course, it's on Amazon.com. If you go there for Kindle or paperback, and it's also for sale on BarnesandNoble.com. So they're the two places I would go first.
And let me just say this. I would get the paperback version as opposed to the Kindle, and let me tell you why. The tactile interaction with the book will give you, I think, it will really give you an impression. I can't explain it to you, but man, when I try to read any material online, I just don't seem to absorb it as well as I do when I'm holding it in my hands and looking through it and being able to page through it. So
yeah, good point.
Yeah, I would definitely get there, and the price is really good for this book. Yeah. And I'm looking forward to more books from you as we continue this interesting play with science fiction. And then you got what else you're going to be working on in the future, so we make a note of it?
Well, there's a follow-up book to this, which will be more based in outer space with the aliens. Mm-hmm. So that'll be much more scientific than history focused. And then I'm working on a book right now, which I'm going to put out between these two. That's social science fiction, which creates a society drawing a lot from what's going on today. And so forth, that will hopefully be I'm going to write. It's going to be a science fiction epic because it's going to be over 100,000 words, and hopefully will resonate with people on the order of 1984, but nothing like 1984. But it's just the same type of social commentary.
That's fantastic.
Based in science fiction, so it gives me leeway to, science fiction lets you stretch things and, exaggerate things and take things to a conclusion, which they may not in reality ever get there. But it does illustrate a point. It does tell a story, and like 1984, which is suddenly so popular again after all these years. So that's going to be my next book, and I hope to have that done by the end of the summer. I'm about halfway through it right now, and hopefully in the fall I'm going to publish that.
Well, that's fantastic, and when that book comes out, we'll have to have you as a guest again because I'm sure that you're going to end up. Here's my prediction: Keith Girard, household name. Within 5 years. One of the most prolific authors that kids will have to study as they try to stay awake in literature class.
Right. Yeah, okay, I'll go with that.